Hello everyone, this video is going to be a walkthrough of the urinary system and the male genital system in the 2022 CPT manual. As always, we have our tabs, our markers, and our pens ready to go. Go ahead and flip to the section. Hopefully you already have your tabs there. If not, go ahead and put a tab on page 403. That is where we start the urinary system. This is a fairly straightforward section, not too terribly complicated, but I'm going to point out a few things as we go through it. It'll hopefully make things easier as you're preparing for your national exam. So if you check the next page, which is 404, we have a really great, very simple illustration showing us the different structures of the urinary system. It starts with the kidneys, then we have the ureters, the bladder, and the urethra. Those are the main structures. And they are listed here, but I want to really draw your attention to the difference between the ureters and the urethra. Sometimes these can get confused when you're rushing through to pick a specific code. The ureters are the structures that go from the kidney to the bladder. The urethra goes from the bladder exiting the body. So just make sure, because they're spelled kind of similarly, they look kind of similar, that you are picking the correct code for the correct structure. The table of contents is fairly straightforward, can be helpful to understand the way this section is broken down. And it's going to look really familiar. We're going to have that incision, excision, introduction, repair, laparoscopy, endoscopy for most sections. We'll have a couple of little minor differences, such as urodynamics, which is in the bladder, but most of it's going to be fairly straightforward and repetitive. So let's go ahead and look through. Start with the kidneys. And we're going to have those similar or familiar sections with incision, excision, repair. But we will also have renal transplantation. Remember, renal means kidney if you want to make a note for it. I'm sure you know that, but if you don't, or you're rushing through, go ahead and just make a note for it. So we do have a section just for transplanting kidneys. There's only a few codes, but as you might imagine, it's a fairly complex procedure. So what's important to do in this section, and you see I have already done for some of the codes that I use, is highlight and draw your attention to what makes the codes different, particularly if we are working with a cadaver donor or a living donor. So why don't you go ahead and go through, use your highlighter, your pen, and make a note of the type of donor that is being used for the kidney transplant. That will be helpful when you're on the national exam, so you can quickly get to the correct code, because they will definitely try to trip you up if they're using a code from this section. We're going to have introduction, repair, and then we will have laparoscopic and endoscopic procedures before we get, and an other catch-all section as well, before we get to the ureters. Remember, ureters are these structures leaving the kidneys, going to the bladder, okay? And we'll have that same introduction, sorry, we will have the incision, excision, introduction, repair, laparoscopy, and endoscopy. And then we get to the bladder, which is a fairly complex organ. And there are quite a few more codes than the other structures in this section. So it's good to kind of get familiar with it, see the kind of things that you might be coding from this section. But for the most part, you will see that the sections are the same, with the exception of this urodynamics, which is a section that's for procedures we do to measure specific functions of the bladder. So that's what these codes are for on page 418. We get into repair and laparoscopy, and then endoscopy procedures. One thing I wanted you to make a note of, and I have it several times in here because I do tend to forget, but cystoscopy and Cystoscopy, which is, if you look at 52204, you can see how it's spelled in case you're wondering, because I'm terrible at pronouncing those really long words. Those are interchangeable terms. So if you see cystoscopy or cystoscopy, those are interchangeable in this section, okay? So go ahead and make a note of it somewhere or several places, because that will come up when you're working in this section. All right, and then we get into the urethra. And again, that same pattern. And there's one extra section, which is for manipulation, which is going to be procedures where we're dilating the urethra for whatever purpose. And we have a catch-all section right here, which is for other procedures. And then we get into the male genital system on page 427, which is another system that is fairly straightforward, very simple. And it's just going to, obviously, since we're only talking about one very small section of the body system, or one very small system, it's not going to really go top to bottom. It's just going to be in the most logical order. So we go penis, testes, and on down through there. And then we get into the associated structures. And then our last little section here is prostate. If you want a illustration of the male genital system, there's one on 428, and that can kind of help make sure you understand where different parts of the male genital system are. But once you go through this, it's going to be extremely simple, logical, and a very familiar pattern: incision, destruction, excision, introduction. Those same things we've seen a lot. Now, destruction we don't see all the time, but when we are talking about that in this system, we are mainly looking at lesions being destroyed, things that might be cancerous. We do have a section on manipulation, and that is primarily for, well, it's only now for foreskin manipulation, which could be for a variety of conditions. Testes does include an exploration section, and that is mainly for undescended testes, which can occur. And then we just kind of follow through that same. If you go back and look at the illustration, it'll show you exactly where each section is, but it's going to be the same kind of repeated pattern of types of procedures and very, very few codes. So not a lot to worry about. Prostate is probably going to be the most utilized section in this whole chapter here. And so because we do a lot of prostatectomies where we're removing the prostate, obviously men are prone to prostate cancer after a specific age. There are a lot of procedures related to that. But even though this is the largest section here, it's still just one page, really. And then we have a catch-all other procedures in there as well. And then very, very last part you'll note is reproductive system procedures and intersex surgery. And so this is for male to female surgery or female to male, okay? If you want to make a tab for that, since it's kind of its own section here, that would be appropriate, okay? So that is pretty much it for these sections. I will do another video with a walkthrough of some questions, or at least a report from this section, kind of help us use it a little bit, but it's very straightforward, very logically laid out, and not too many codes. So hopefully this all works well for you, makes sense. But if you do have questions or concerns, feel free to post them, and I will get back with you. Thank you.